What if I told you that the best way for the healthcare system to save money on preventing heart disease is to basically prescribe a treatment protocol that ends up costing an extra $40 million?
Right. I mean, it sounds like a complete mathematical contradiction.
It totally does. But today we are unpacking a massive economic simulation that, proves why keeping people alive longer is actually the most expensive and yet most incredibly efficient thing modern medicine can do.
Yeah, and it really forces a complete rethinking of how we look at population health, honestly.
Because for decades, right, the medical community has relied on very specific cholesterol markers to figure out who needs more aggressive preventative therapies.
Exactly. And we're now looking at this really robust economic data suggesting that our continued reliance on traditional targets might literally be leaving thousands of healthy years on the table.
All because we are measuring the wrong thing. Right, let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to break down this fascinating new economic evaluation study. We're looking for the absolute most cost-effective way to measure heart health risk for you, the listener, and prevent atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease.
Or ASCVD.
ASCVD. So the study measures 3 distinct lipid targets to figure out which one should guide our use of lipid-lowering therapies. Things like statins or ezetimibe.
And they're comparing the traditional standard, which is LDL-C, against a broader measure, non-HDL-C.
And then pitting both of those against this sort of rising star of preventative cardiology, which is Apolipoprotein B or ApoB.
Yeah, ApoB. And the clash between these guidelines is really rooted in this problem of residual risk.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, clinicians consistently see patients who hit their traditional LDL targets. So in the context of this study, that's getting your LDL-C below 100 milligrams per deciliter.
Okay, so a passing grade on the blood test.
Exactly. Yet those same patients still go on to suffer fatal or non-fatal myocardial infarctions, heart attacks.
Wow, so the medication is doing its job according to the lab slip, but the disease just continues to progress anyway.
Right. And clinical science has increasingly pointed to ApoB as the superior marker for this residual risk because of what it actually measures in the bloodstream.
Okay, let me make sure I'm visualizing the mechanics of this correctly, because I think this is where the difference between measuring mass and counting particles becomes super crucial.
Go for it.
So think of your bloodstream as this really busy highway, right? And the atherogenic particles floating around in there, those are like a fleet of dump trucks carrying a load of trash.
So that's a good way to look at it.
Right, so the traditional test, LDL, essentially sets up a weigh station on the side of that highway. It just measures the total weight of the cholesterol, the trash inside the dump trucks that pass by.
But the limitation of the weigh station is that it only gives you total mass.
Right.
The actual damage to the arterial wall, the buildup of plaque that leads to ASCVD, is not caused by the total weight of the cholesterol.
Wait, it's not?
No, the damage happens when individual particles actually crash into and penetrate the endothelial lining of the highway.
Oh, I see.
So you could have a relatively low total mass of cholesterol, easily hitting that under 100 target we talked about. But that mass could be distributed across thousands of tiny, dense, highly aggressive particles.
Which means you have a massive fleet of reckless little dump trucks crashing into the walls, even if they aren't carrying a heavy load.
Exactly. And that brings us to the ApoB target.
Because ApoB doesn't bother weighing the trash, right?
Nope. It counts the actual number of dump trucks on the highway.
Wow.
Yeah, every single one of those dangerous plaque-causing particles has exactly one ApoB molecule attached to its surface.
So by counting the ApoB molecules, you get an exact census of the vehicles capable of crashing into the arterial wall.
Exactly. It gives a vastly more accurate picture of the residual risk to your heart.
But if the clinical superiority of ApoB is pretty much accepted, why isn't it just the standard everywhere already? The study pushes for a really aggressive goal, right? Getting ApoB below 78.7 milligrams per deciliter.
Well, it comes down to the fact that the healthcare system operates on budgets, resource allocation, massive insurance apparatuses.
The money part.
Right. A marker being clinically superior in a laboratory setting does not automatically mean it makes financial sense to overhaul national prescription guidelines.
Because changing the primary target means, what? Ordering different labs, altering algorithms for millions of patients?
And potentially increasing the dosages of statins across the whole population.
The ultimate hurdle is proving that the juice is worth the squeeze.
Exactly.
But you can't just take 3 groups of 1 million actual patients, randomly assign them to LDL, non-HDL, or ApoB targets, and then just wait 40 years to see who ends up costing the system more in emergency bypass surgeries.
Right. That is an impossible experiment to run in real time. It would take decades.
So how did the researchers actually test this?
They bypassed that biological limitation by constructing a highly sophisticated microsimulation.
A digital model.
Yeah, they built a digital cohort of 250,000 simulated U.S. adults. And the study specifies that these digital individuals were entirely ASCVD-free at the start of the model.
Meaning no prior heart attacks or strokes or anything.
Right, but they carried enough risk factors to be statin eligible under primary prevention guidelines.
Okay, but I have to ask, a simulation is only as good as the code it runs on, right? Like, if these are just generic avatars with totally random health stats, the economic output means literally nothing to real-world policymakers.
Oh, absolutely. But they grounded the simulation in concrete epidemiological data. The model is actually built using the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey.
Oh, NAANEs.
Yes, NANS. Drawing from multiple cycles between 2005 and 2016, they extracted the detailed medical profiles of 4,149 actual participants.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, we're talking about real corresponding data points for blood pressure, smoking history, age, demographic background, and comprehensive lipid panels.
So they took those 4,149 distinct real-world biological profiles and mathematically scaled them up.
Right, using statistical bootstrapping to generate 250,000 unique lifetimes to simulate.
That's incredible. So once this virtual city of 250,000 people is populated, how does the model handle the medical interventions over a lifetime? Like, what triggers a change in a simulated person's daily medication?
The model adheres strictly to the 2018 American Heart Association and American College of Cardiology guidelines.
Okay.
Everyone in the cohort receives a baseline lipid screening and is placed on an appropriate statin therapy. But the crucial variable is the intensification of that therapy.
What do you mean by intensification?
Well, the model constantly checks if the individual is hitting their assigned diagnostic goal. So if a simulated patient in the LDL group has a level of 105, missing that 100 target, their therapy is intensified.
Got it. So in real-world clinical terms, intensification means moving a patient from a moderate-intensity statin to a high-intensity statin, like bumping up to 40 milligrams of rosuvastatin.
Or adding a secondary non-statin therapy like ezetimibe to block cholesterol absorption in the gut.
And obviously, those changes carry their own costs in the model.
Exactly. The simulation continuously tallies those lifelong pharmacy costs alongside the, catastrophic costs of medical events if the preventative therapy fails.
Right.
And to measure who actually wins this face-off, the researchers utilized two vital metrics. First, lifetime costs were calculated and projected into 2025 US dollars.
Discounted for inflation and all that.
Heavily discounted at an annual rate of 3.0% to account for the time value of money. Yeah. But the ultimate metric for success in health economics is the quality-adjusted life year.
Or QALY.
The QAL, yes.
Okay, let's drill down into the mechanics of a QALY, because it feels like the linchpin of this entire evaluation. The model isn't just counting birthdays to see who lives the longest, right? It's actively grading the health condition of those years.
It raises a really important question in health economics. How do we mathematically quantify the burden of disease?
Right.
A QLE measures both quantity and quality simultaneously. So one full year of life lived in perfect, vigorous health is assigned a value of 1.0 QALY.
Okay, that makes sense.
But when a simulated individual suffers a cardiovascular event, the model doesn't just bill them for the hospital stay. It applies a utility decrement.
So if a digital patient suffers a non-fatal stroke in the simulation, they might survive for another 10 years, but those years are no longer worth 1.0.
Exactly. They might drop to a 0.6 or a 0.4 depending on the severity of the disability.
Which means 10 chronological years only generate 4 or 6 QALYs for the final tally.
You've got it perfectly. And the researchers established a very specific threshold for this study. They determined that a preventative strategy is officially cost-effective if it requires spending less than $120,000 for every single QALY gained across the population.
Okay, I have to pause on that number. The idea of a willingness to pay threshold is fascinating, but if I look at this strictly from like a taxpayer or insurance premium perspective, 120 grand to purchase just one single year of healthy life for one person sounds astronomically high.
It does sound like a lot.
How do health economists justify setting the bar at 6 figures for one trip around the sun?
Well, the justification comes from comparing the cost of prevention to the devastating financial reality of acute treatment.
Like surgery and stuff.
Exactly. We tend to drastically underestimate the sheer expense of a catastrophic cardiovascular event.
Oh, sure.
A coronary artery bypass graft, the subsequent cardiac rehabilitation, the ICU stay, the lifetime of specialized follow-up care.
Not to mention the massive loss of economic productivity.
Right. All of that far outweighs the cost of decades of generic daily statins. Society is generally willing to absorb a high upfront cost to secure a healthy year of life because the alternative managing chronic, severe disease bankrupts the system much faster.
So a $120,000 threshold is actually a rigorously calculated benchmark for efficient resource allocation.
Exactly.
Okay, so the threshold is set. We have the $120,000 benchmark, our 250,000 simulated lives running on real NHE's data, and our 3 clinical targets. LDL at 100, non-HDL at 118, and ApoB at 78.7.
Let's look at what the model actually spit out when it ran these lifetimes to completion.
Yes, the results.
So they evaluated this in a stepwise fashion. First, they looked at the challenger, non-HDL, against the traditional LDL standard.
And what happened?
Targeting non-HDL instead of LDL yielded an impressive gain of 965 QALYs across the cohort.
Wow, so that is nearly a millennium of perfect, healthy human life added to the population.
Right. And remarkably, achieving that health gain actually reduced overall healthcare costs by $2.1 million.
Whoa. It achieved the holy grail of health economics.
It really did.
So the system improved population health and literally saved millions of dollars in the process, presumably because tracking the broader non-HDL marker prevented just enough expensive heart attacks to offset the cost of intensifying the statins.
That's exactly it. Non-HDL is clear improvement over LDL, but the researchers knew it still had a clinical ceiling.
Because it captures more atherogenic particles than LDL, but it remains a surrogate measure. It still leaves residual risk undetected.
Right. So the model processed the final step, pitting the non-HDL strategy against the highly precise ApoB target.
And the leap in population health was massive, wasn't it?
Well, it was. When the simulation targeted ApoB, keeping levels below 78.7, the cohort gained an additional 1,324 QALYs compared to the non-HDL group.
So the clinical mechanism worked exactly as designed. Counting the actual dump trucks prevented significantly more crashes than just weighing the total trash.
Yes, but the financial output flipped. Targeting ApoB increased the overall costs by $40.2 million.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. I am looking at this glaring contradiction in the math right now.
I know, it sounds wild.
We just established that the goal of this evaluation is to find the most cost-effective path. We celebrated the non-HDL strategy because it saved the system $2.1 million. Now we're looking at ApoB, and it costs $40 million extra. Yet the study concludes that ApoB is the ultimate winner.
Yep.
Why is a strategy that blows a $40 million hole in the budget considered an economic triumph?
Okay, so the instinctive reaction is to assume that the diagnostic test itself is the culprit.
Right, because ApoB is a newer, highly precise molecular assay. The lab work must just cost a fortune compared to a routine lipid panel.
Exactly, we naturally assume that. But the study details that the ApoB test is remarkably cheap.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the assay itself is a marginal expense.
Yeah.
The $40.2 million increase in total system costs has absolutely nothing to do with pricey lab equipment.
Then what is it?
The total cost jumps purely because the patients live significantly longer.
The cost of survival.
Exactly that. The model tracks lifetime costs. When you utilize a marker as accurate as ApoB, your statin intensifications become highly targeted and incredibly effective at preventing fatal events.
So your simulated patients don't die of massive coronaries in their early 60s.
Right. They survive into their 70s and 80s. And, well, human beings who live an extra 15 years consume more health care.
Oh, of course. They require a decade and a half of additional daily statins. They attend more routine primary care visits.
They eventually undergo knee replacements or require treatment for unrelated conditions that they otherwise wouldn't have lived long enough to develop.
Wow. Returning to our highway analogy, it's as if we finally deployed a traffic system that entirely stopped the dump trucks from destroying the road.
Right.
But because the highway stays open and perfectly functional for decades longer than it used to, the state naturally has to pay for more routine maintenance, paint, and basic upkeep over its extended lifespan.
That is a perfect analogy. The extra expense is proof that the system is working flawlessly.
That is mind-blowing.
And that phenomenon is why health economists rely on the incremental cost-effectiveness ratio, or ICER.
Okay.
The ICER isolates the cost of that specific health gain. So when the researchers calculated the ICER for the ApoB strategy, it came out to $30,300 per QALY gained.
Let's contextualize that against our benchmark.
Yeah.
The accepted willingness to pay threshold, the absolute maximum society is willing to spend to buy one healthy year of life is $120,000.
Yeah.
And the ApoB strategy is delivering those identical, high-quality years for just $30,300 each.
It is a profound bargain. The healthcare system is buying disease-free human lifespan at roughly 25% of what it is willing to authorize.
That's incredible. But to ensure this wasn't just like a mathematical fluke in a single run, didn't the researchers subject the model to some kind of probabilistic sensitivity analysis?
They did. They ran the simulation repeatedly, slightly altering the variables.
Like changing statin prices.
Changing statin prices, adjusting the baseline risk of the population, tweaking the utility decrements for stroke and infarction, just to see how robust the financial outcome truly was.
Right, you want to stress test the model to see if ApoB falls apart, if, say, a generic drug suddenly gets more expensive.
Exactly, and the dominance of ApoB held firm. At that $120,000 per QALY threshold, the ApoB goal emerged as the optimal strategy in 65% of the probabilistic analyses.
Wow, 65%. What about non-HDL?
The non-HDL goal was optimal in only 25%. Across the vast majority of projected scenarios, counting the particles via ApoB was the undisputed most efficient way to maximize population health.
So what does this all mean for you, the person listening right now, perhaps looking at a printout of your latest blood work?
Yeah, what's the takeaway?
The core takeaway from this incredibly complex 250,000-person digital simulation is that using ApoB to guide primary prevention therapies is literally one of the most cost-effective strategies available in modern cardiology.
Absolutely. The clinical science proves it accurately maps the dangerous particles driving residual risk.
And the rigorous economic data proves it purchases years of healthy life at a deeply efficient price point.
It really completely dispels the persistent myth that advanced precision medicine must inherently be more expensive for the system.
Right. We always assume that to get the best clinical outcome, we have to break the bank.
But this economic evaluation proves that deploying the most precise clinical tool counting the actual atherogenic particles aligns perfectly with the most responsible financial stewardship. We are quite literally saving money by spending it on the exact right target.
So the next time you find yourself discussing your cardiovascular risk profile, you might want to ask your doctor about checking your ApoB levels.
Definitely.
You can initiate that conversation knowing you aren't just chasing a niche clinical trend, you are advocating for a strategy backed by the highest levels of health economic modeling.
And, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces a deeply uncomfortable audit of our diagnostic inertia.
What do you mean?
Well, if tracking ApoB is this clearly cost-effective precisely because it prevents fatal events and extends life, it begs the question, what other highly accurate, relatively inexpensive molecular tests are we systematically ignoring today?
Just because massive medical institutions are stubbornly habituated to measuring the older, far less precise markers?
Exactly.
That is a staggering question about how slowly large systems adapt to new data. And navigating that system effectively all starts with understanding exactly what number you should be looking for on that lab report.